My brother kicked me out after I discovered his secret. What was he hiding? I stood in the muddy yard, clutching my old gym bag. My brother, Andrew, had just thrown me out of the house. The same house where we'd grown up, where Mom baked cherry pies that filled the air with sweetness, and Dad taught us how to patch bike tires in the garage under the hum of fluorescent lights. His eyes had blazed with a fury I'd never glimpsed before, his voice cracking as he screamed, "Get out and don't come back!" The door slammed shut with a force that rattled my bones, leaving me drenched, shivering, and lost in the dark. All because of what I'd found in the basement. All because of that damned metal box he'd kept hidden from me, from everyone. It had started just a few hours earlier, on a dreary Saturday afternoon. I'd gone down to the basement to dig up Mom's old lamp, the one with the tacky floral shade she'd switch on during our family movie nights, casting warm shadows across the living room. Andrew had been acting off lately. He'd started locking the basement door, a habit he'd never had before, and brushed off my questions with grunts about fixing stuff down there. I figured it was just him being his usual weird self. He'd always liked tinkering alone, building odd contraptions, or taking apart radios for fun. But that day, I noticed the lock hanging crooked, like it had been slapped on in a hurry. My curiosity got the better of me, and I couldn't resist. The basement stairs creaked under my sneakers as I descended into the dim, cluttered space. A strange smell hit me, a sharp mix of rust and something sickly sweet, like syrup left out too long. The room was a mess. Stacks of warped cardboard boxes, rusted tools scattered across a workbench, and piles of junk we'd sworn to sort through years ago, but never did. But in the far corner, under a grimy tarp, something stood out, a sleek metal box, about the size of a small suitcase, with shiny padlocks that caught the faint light. It didn't belong here. Everything else was old, forgotten. This was new, deliberate, out of place. My heart thudded against my ribs. I knew I shouldn't mess with it. Andrew would lose it if he caught me snooping, but the box seemed to pull me in, whispering secrets I didn't yet understand. I glanced back at the stairs. He was upstairs, clattering pots in the kitchen, probably making one of his late lunches. I had a narrow window. The locks clicked open too easily, and when I lifted the lid, the air thickened around me. Inside was a chaotic jumble, a handful of faded photographs, a knife crusted with dark red stains, a bundle of papers tied with twine, and my stomach lurched. A small glass jar with something floating in cloudy liquid. It looked like a human finger, pale and shriveled. I froze, my breath catching at my throat. What the hell was this? I stared at the jar, my mind racing to make sense of it. Was this some sick prank? A prop from one of Andrew's weird projects? But the smell, that metallic tang mixed with a cloying sweetness, told me this was no joke. My hand shook as I reached for the photographs, yellowed at the edges like they'd been stashed away for years. They showed strangers, grim-faced men and women in outdated clothes, staring blankly at the camera. One photo stopped me cold. A teenage Andrew, his hair longer and messier, standing next to a man in a dark coat. They were posed in front of a weathered barn I vaguely recognized from a trip to our cousin's rural town ages ago. Scrawled on the back in jagged handwriting were the words, "Don't forget what you promised." A chill slithered down my spine, prickling my skin. I barely had time to process it when heavy footsteps thudded overhead. Andrew was coming. Panic surged through me. I snapped the box shut, the clang echoing in the damp basement, and stumbled toward the stairs, grabbing Mom's lamp as a flimsy excuse. He appeared in the doorway, his broad frame blocking the light from the kitchen above. His eyes darted to the corner where the box sat, then locked onto me. "What are you doing down here?" His voice was low, laced with something dangerous, like a wire pulled taut. "Just looking for the lamp," I stammered, holding it up like a shield. My voice cracked, betraying me. He wasn't fooled. His face twisted into a snarl, and before I could blink, he lunged, grabbing my collar and yanking me forward. "You saw it, didn't you? You saw it!" he roared, his breath hot against my face. His grip tightened, and I could feel the heat radiating off him, the wild edge in his eyes. I opened my mouth to lie, to say anything to calm him down, but he didn't wait for an answer. He dragged me up the stairs, my feet scrambling for traction on the worn steps. The lamp slipped from my hands, crashing somewhere behind us, but he didn't stop. Through the kitchen we went, past the sink piled with dishes, past the fridge humming softly, and straight to the front door. My gym bag was already there, slumped against the wall like he'd packed it in advance, like he'd known this moment was coming. He shoved me out into the yard, the cold rain hitting me like a slap. "Get out and don't come back," he shouted, his voice breaking with rage or something else, fear maybe. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing in my ears as I stood there, soaked and stunned, the weight of what I'd seen sinking in. What was in that box? Why was Andrew so desperate to keep it hidden? My brother, the guy who'd once stayed up all night helping me build a model rocket for school, had just turned into someone I didn't recognize. I needed answers, but right then, all I had was the rain and a growing dread that whatever he was hiding was bigger, darker than I could imagine. I ended up at my friend Sam's place, dripping wet and shaking, my gym bag slung over my shoulder like a lifeline. He didn't ask much when I showed up, just raised an eyebrow and tossed me a towel. "You and Andrew fighting again?" he said, his tone light but wary. I nodded, keeping the nightmare details to myself. "Something like that," I muttered, collapsing onto his lumpy couch. The towel smelled faintly of laundry detergent, a small comfort as I tried to piece together what had happened. Sam didn't push, just handed me a beer and left me to my thoughts. But my thoughts were a mess, a tangle of that box, Andrew's rage, and the finger in the jar. I couldn't let it go. Andrew had always been the quiet one, the older brother who kept his feelings locked up tight. He'd fix things, cars, radios, broken toys, but he never talked much, especially after Dad died. This, though? This was something else. Something sinister. I replayed the scene in the basement over and over, the photos, the knife, that cryptic note. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, old memories started bubbling up, stuff I'd ignored as a kid. Mom's hushed arguments with Dad late at night, their voices sharp through the thin walls. Andrew tagging along on Dad's errands, coming back silent and sullen. And that one time, maybe a year before Dad's crash, when Mom said, almost to herself, "Andrew's always been your father's shadow." I'd been too young to question it then. Dad died when I was 10, Andrew 15. A car accident, they said. I'd never dug deeper. Now, I wondered if I should have. By Monday morning, I'd made up my mind. I had to go to that barn from the photo. It was the only lead I had, the only thing tying that box to something real. Sam tried to talk me out of it over coffee. "You sure you want to poke this bear, man? Andrew's pissed already." But I couldn't sit still, couldn't let it fester. "I have to know," I said, draining my mug. The drive was 6 hours to the rural town our cousins used to live in, a place I hadn't seen since I was a kid. The whole way, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. What if Andrew was following me? What if he'd already cleared out the basement, erased whatever he was hiding? The questions gnawed at me, but I kept driving, the highway stretching out like a thread pulling me toward the truth. The town was a ghost when I got there. Cracked houses with peeling paint, overgrown yards choked with weeds, and a gray sky that seemed to press down on everything. The barn loomed at the edge, half collapsed, its wooden walls blackened by time and weather. I parked a safe distance away and walked over, my boots sinking into the wet earth. The wind carried a faint, eerie whine, like the place was mourning its own decay. Whatever Andrew was tangled up in, it started here, or at least, this was where I'd find the next piece of the puzzle. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the shadows, ready to face whatever was waiting. The barn stank of mold and rot, the air thick with dampness that clung to my skin. My flashlight beam darted across the cluttered floor, broken pitchforks, rusted cans, and soggy hay bales piled in uneven stacks. Cobwebs hung like curtains, swaying faintly as I moved deeper inside. The place felt alive in the worst way, whispering secrets in the creaks and groans of the decaying wood. I scanned every corner, my pulse hammering, until the light landed on something, a rusted metal chest tucked behind a mound of straw that looked ready to collapse. It wasn't the same box from the basement, but it felt connected, like a shadow of the one Andrew had guarded so fiercely. My hands trembled as I knelt and pried it open, the hinges screeching in protest. Letters spilled out, dozens of them, yellowed and crinkled, written in Dad's jagged handwriting. I sank to my knees, the damp floor soaking through my jeans, and started reading by the shaky glow of my flashlight. They were addressed to Andrew, dated years before Dad's death. "You're old enough now," one began. "This is our burden, our duty. The town had to be cleansed." My stomach twisted as I flipped through more. Another mentioned the group, men Dad worked with, men who understood what needed to be done. The words blurred as the truth sank in. Dad wasn't just the quiet mechanic I remembered, tinkering in the garage with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He'd been part of something awful, a vigilante crew, a cult, something that left blood on his hands. And Andrew had followed him into it. One letter near the bottom made my blood run cold. "The trophies prove your loyalty. Keep them safe." The finger in the jar flashed to my mind. Not some random relic, but evidence, a sick rite of passage. My breath came in shallow gasps as I shoved the letters into my jacket, their weight pressing against my chest. I staggered to my feet, the barn spinning around me. Outside, the wind howled louder, rattling the loose boards, and I stumbled back to my car, the truth clawing at me like a living thing. Dad and Andrew, what had they done? Who had they hurt? The photos, the knife, the finger, it was all tied to this place, to whatever cleansing Dad had dragged my brother into. The drive back was a blur, my mind replaying every word, every line. I couldn't go home, not yet. Andrew would be there, or worse, he wouldn't, and I'd be left with an empty house full of ghosts. Instead, I headed straight to the police station, my jacket bulging with the letters. The officer at the desk, a tired guy with gray stubble, raised an eyebrow as I spilled my story, my voice hoarse and frantic. I showed him the blurry photos I'd snapped of the box's contents on my phone, the knife and jar glaring in the dim screen light. "We'll look into it," he said, his tone flat but firm. "Don't go near your brother till we figure this out." I nodded, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. Whatever happened next, I'd opened a door I couldn't close. Weeks crawled by, each day heavier than the last. I rented a cramped apartment across town, a dingy one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper, and a faucet that dripped non-stop. The police had searched the house, they told me over a crackling phone call, but Andrew was gone. The basement was empty, no box, no knife, no jar. Just bare shelves and dust, like he'd erased it all before they got there. "We've got your statement and the letters," the officer said. "We're still digging. Sit tight." But sitting tight felt like drowning. I jumped at every creak, every shadow, half expecting Andrew to barge in and finish what he'd started that night in the rain. I couldn't sleep. The letters haunted me, Dad's words looping in my head, Andrew's face in that old photo, the finger floating in its jar. I'd piece it together in the dark. Dad pulling Andrew into some twisted legacy, cleansing that rural town of whoever they deemed unworthy. The trophies were proof, sick keepsakes of their work. But why? And how far had Andrew gone? I'd lost my brother, not to a fight or time, but to something I couldn't even name yet. The cops kept investigating, chasing leads from the letters, but they couldn't trace much. Could be old crimes, could be nothing, they said. I knew better. It was something, and it was eating me alive. Sam checked in now and then, bringing takeout or just sitting with me in silence. You did what you could, he said one night, cracking open a beer. Andrew made his choices. But it didn't feel that way. Mom's voice echoed in my dreams, soft and sad. Why didn't you save him? I'd wake up sweating, guilt gnawing at me. Save him from what? The shadow Dad cast? The blood on that knife? I didn't even know who he was anymore. Now, I live with the pieces, half a story, half a family. The house sits empty, or so the cops say. I don't go back. I can't. Whatever Andrew's hiding, wherever he's gone, it's his burden now. But late at night, when the faucet drips and the city hums outside, I wonder if he's out there, watching, waiting. And I wonder if I'll ever stop looking over my shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up. Now write what do you think about the story in comments.